Fine. Well, here we are with the first of two books that I'm going to be talking about. 90% of it will be based upon Aviva Chomsky's book, Is Science Enough? 40 Critical Questions About Climate Justice. This is Noam Chomsky's daughter. And she does look like a bookish kind of person, and she is a professor of history and coordinator of Latin American studies at Salem State University in Massachusetts. She has a friend, I guess, about 10 years younger than she is, Chad Montree, who is at the University of Massachusetts in Lowell. And he wrote this on the back of her book, and I have to agree with just about every word he says. This primer on climate change goes beyond the usual scientific, technical, and policy dimensions to focus on the ways power and inequality matter too. It deftly and lucidly puts the impending ecological disaster in proper perspective, framing it as an environmental and a social crisis. And it's the toughest talk I've ever prepared in my 10 years of doing this, or I guess it's, 12 years now, because it goes into matters that are just not very popular, and we just don't like to talk about sometimes. Basic fundamental matters like wanting to make money and wanting to be always having everything get bigger and greater in terms of income and consumption every year. That's our religion, it seems, and that's the problem with climate change and the crisis that is described. Her book is divided into 6 sections. A lot of it at the beginning is technological questions. Can technology alone solve our crisis? I'll talk a little bit about Kyoto and Paris agreements under the policy questions. The third one is what can an individual do? And for that, I'll jump into a sister book. I shouldn't call it sister, but it's on the same topic, written by Elizabeth Cripps at the University of Edinburgh. And we'll touch on that too. Their fourth one is social and economic justice. Just a typical one, do pandemics affect our climate? But there's much more than that in there. The most challenging part is called broadening the lens, and only one of the, I think there are about 4 items discussed deals with population growth, but it should be dealt with. And then in conclusion, who should be leading us? That's one of many questions in the inclusion section. So we have a lot of material to cover. I should mention that in her book, Aviva's book, there is not one diagram or table. It's all pure text. So 2 things I've done is tried to take her statements and compress them, but not change the meaning, and also insert any graphs or tables that I think could amplify her point of view. So you'll notice also that I changed the color from time to time of the print, just so that we won't all fall asleep reading white on green. This is leading to some of the technical questions. She says eco-modernists, as she calls people who are ecologically oriented and very much high-tech people, they believe that industrial society can solve the climate problem that caused it. That it caused, I'm sorry. And they include artificial intelligence, AI, smart grids, carbon capture, and so on. Sometimes I think rather glibly, and she thinks so too. But the global economy, she points out, relies on more growth and more consumption. So we must use ecology and look beyond the surface. And then as we get into the meat of it, she says, let's define greenhouse gases. Now that's why I sent out to all of you the interesting, I guess you could say, I think it was a 40-page book or 20-page book called Faustian Bargain, written by Professor Anderson, I believe, a week ago. And I hope that you noticed on page 6, there is a much better definition of greenhouse gases than she gives here. She just says they trap heat in the Earth's atmosphere. CO2 accounts for 80% of it, methane 10%. And she said methane, however, and she's so right here, could be a lot higher since much of it is unmeasured. And then she asks the question, how do we make them all? Well, let's answer that question with this one. Um, this is a fascinating graph. It looks awfully dark, and it is, because if you look at the fossils that are represented in black here, and go back quite a few years to 1965, and then go forward 50 years to 2015, you'll see that we haven't really done an awful lot about dealing with our fossil consumption. I mean, by fossil, I mean um, wood, mostly coal, of course, wood and um, natural gas. There are lots of others, diesels, and all kinds of fossil fuels, gasoline that emit CO2. And so, but just looking at the consumption here, you can see that hydro, that's been around for 100 years. So by 1960, it was pretty stable, and about 70% of the 7% of the country's energy was coming from hydro. I grew up in Linden, Ontario. We just called it Ontario Hydro because everything came from Niagara Falls, and it was just a less than 100 miles away, and very easy source of energy, nice and green. And then along came nuclear energy in Canada and here, of course, and that's since 2000, it's sort of petered out a bit, and been whatever has petered out has been picked up by tiny amounts of geothermal, biomass, wind, and solar. So her point is, at the rate we're going, we'll never get ahead of the problem. We've got to do something to improve that. And so I've chosen this table. It's a bit of an odd one. The stuff that you see there on the left, let's pull that aside. I'm just looking now at the right table, regional use of coal and solar. Just picked two items. Coal is in beigey gray there, and wind and solar are combined in green. And we can look at the world and see that in the 5 years in the last decade, from 2015 to 2020, we haven't accomplished an awful lot as a species on a planet. We're still burning a lot of coal. There are other things in there too that make up the 100%. So this is all kinds of other fossil fuels mostly. Nuclear is not mentioned in there. Hydro is not mentioned. So we're just looking at coal. And you can see that in the 5 years, it's probably improved for the world from about 6% or so, maybe up to 10% of is wind and solar. Those are the very popular green things that everybody reflexively talks about, even though they're 1,000-fold less efficient in generating energy than the fossil fuels and coal in particular. If you look at India, it's clearly burning a lot of coal, even more percentage-wise than China, starting off over 75% 5 years ago and dropping back to maybe 70% now, with a little bit of wind and solar. Same for China, pretty much. Their combination of the two is pretty stable the past 5 years or so. United States, done a bit better. Our coal has come down as a nation from about 35% or so, 30% to 17%. So that's almost dropped in half. And the wind and solar has practically doubled. So that's pretty good. EU has done even better. We started off in a better position 5 years ago, and they've really done quite a bit better than we have. Considering that they're north of us, probably a lot of that is based upon wind, because we're in a little more favorable latitude for solar. Coming to the left of the graph, we see just some figures to remind you of a year ago reviewed Bill Gates. And these are basically his numbers, but she repeats them. Transportation as a source of energy is about a quarter, electricity a quarter, industry a little around a quarter, and buildings and agriculture, if you fuse them, about a quarter. So the low-hanging fruit was supposed to be electricity and transportation. And next, I'll talk about transportation and show that we haven't done very well for the low-hanging fruit. Later on, we'll move into buildings and agriculture. If you look at the graph on the upper right, I'm sorry that the numbers are not very, very clear, but basically it starts off in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s. We were only getting about 13 miles per gallon for fuel efficiency of cars and light trucks. And it gradually improved through the 80s and 90s. When we got to around 1990, things sort of plateaued off. And I think she thinks it's because SUV sales increased. And I agree with her. Everybody got to thinking, well, it would be nice to have an SUV and we can go off to the cottage and we can get stuck anywhere. And since 2004, light truck sales have increased quite a bit too. So that's caused a regular increase up to 2017. That's sort of a sobering fact I didn't realize before. The average number of passenger miles driven has increased 46% in the last 30 years. So that's, we talked about that a little bit before, how when we improve mileage, people would just drive more. And so it doesn't really, isn't such easy to handle low-hanging fruit. We're just big consumers. And when it doesn't cost so much, we just go in and drive more. Last point was she mentions that electric vehicles are being promoted, but the United States is responding slowly, and that's true. What was regarded as easy fruit has not yet been plucked. I couldn't resist putting in that little picture at the bottom. I thought it was real charming. She's got 3 kids. Everybody's with a helmet. I can't tell if she's pedaling that or whether it's electric. I'm sure it's not motorized, but I just thought it was charming. Of course, they're not on a street here. They're on presumably a protected plaza, shopping mall or something like that. So they look pretty safe, but it's a charming image. Something that we don't very often do. As soon as we get a dog, everybody has to have an SUV. And so we love excuses for getting SUVs. A number of my elderly friends of my spouse, when I ask them why they're not driving a fuel efficient vehicle, they say, well, I have a hard time sitting down inside a hybrid car. I really need an SUV that I can climb up into. And I wish that weren't the case. I'm not sure the solution to that, but it's really unfortunate because their mileage is cut in half most of the time when they go for an SUV. Then she talks about the top 3 industries when we deal with industry and talks about chemical, mining, and refining. She points out the politics of climate change ignore the massive contributions of the industrial sector. We focus on the things that are politically interesting, like steel and concrete, and we kind of ignore ammonia production, which is our top chemical sector emitter. At 60% of that, I guess, is ammonia, and 40% of emissions come from chemical processing of methane into ammonia and CO2. There are better ways, but I'm not going to go into it here, but certainly there are better ways of making fertilizer and ammonia. Cement also is talked about a good bit. It's responsible for 8% of the world's emissions 4 years ago. And there's a big talk by Bill Gates and others of a new form of cement that's far, far less carbon emitting, CO2 emitting. And I think it costs still a bit more, maybe 20 or 30% more, but hopefully those costs can come down so that it can be used more frequently. China is known for its refining of all these materials: alumina, glass, soda ash, ammonia, and calcium chloride. And of course, that takes up a lot of energy. At least China is building nuclear plants, so might help in some of those. I think the vast majority of them, though, are for just making electricity. Agriculture, she points out, make up 10% of all the emissions in the United States, focusing on this country for a while. She says the life cycle analysis of food production can triple that. And going down to the yellow line, I think to talk to some examples, if you include in agriculture manufacturing, if you look at the whole life cycle analysis by including farm machinery, fertilizers, pesticides, that will add quite a bit more to agriculture-related emissions. In navy blue, I've put raising livestock, and I didn't realize we have 70 billion animals on the planet. That's about 10 animals for every person. Accounts for over half of our global agricultural emissions. Now, if you look up livestock in the definitions, Wikipedia or any other place or definitions, you'll find that livestock, most of the time, a little over half the time, refers to hoofed animals from cattle, horses, pigs, sheep, etc., and not chickens or poultry. But there is a good percentage of the time livestock does include poultry and birds and sometimes even fish. So if it's in a fish farm. So it just depends. But I think that number 70 billion relates to farm animals rather than poultry or fish. So it's an interesting idea, 10 animals for every person. I think if we, without having to become a vegetarian, there are an awful lot of beef out there, and we could, if we chose, and we're really serious about the problems of climate change, modify our diets so that we don't have to have 10 animals for every one of us. And that's on the planet, I'm talking. Looking overhead, what have we looking ahead, I mean, what have we overlooked? And international aviation is a big one, shipping and the military. She calls it the 3 ASM. They're expected to double or triple by 2050. This is the most depressing thought. How are we possibly going to be able to hold the line if something like this is going to double or triple? Now, people in aviation are quite concerned about it, and I'm sure you've all read about that. And they're trying to soft pedal it by saying, well, we'll talk more about this later, but we'll make some alternative investments in forests, and we'll account for that, and so we'll feel better about it. Shipping is one that's easier to tackle because you don't have this problem of the weight of batteries or hydrogen storage or all these problems. And of course, we've been, as we'll learn about in 2 weeks, when I'll talk about nuclear shipping a little bit, there's some strong advocacy going on now to put more and more small, not necessarily small modular, but molten salt reactors into ships. They're considered a very safe, small system to have them in shipping, and could reduce tremendously the pollution from the crude oil that is being burned in most of our ships. The military also is a big problem, and that leads to the line in dark blue. The US Department of Defense is the largest producer of greenhouse gases in the world, making 55 million metric tons just 4 years ago in that year alone. Well, it's not hard to imagine that our Department of Defense is the largest producer in the world because we've got the largest military. In fact, we spend more on our military than all the other countries of the world spend on their respective military. So that's not too surprising, but when you see that number, 55 million metric tons, Bill Gates told us we have to get it down from 51 billion metric tons. So 55 million is 1/1000th of that, just in our Department of Defense. Sure would be nice if we could get them to cut back. She said that jet fuel is their biggest source, and it's followed by maintenance facilities. And future goals, again, are mostly limited to feel-good carbon offsets. We'll talk about that a little bit later. She, what she says about nuclear energy is found in one paragraph on page 20. And these are pretty much her words. The title is her word. The most controversial zero emission energy source is nuclear power. Well, I think we can all agree it is controversial. And then she says, and these are her words pretty much summarized, some environmentalists advocate expanding nuclear power, noting its clean, dense energy 24/7. but others reject it, fearing its radioactive waste and the threat of nuclear meltdown. I think she summarizes the situation very clearly. She takes no position. So let me add my position on the lower half of the slide. This is a very summarized slide from one that our Friends of Fishing group put together, showing Germany. I've just shown the first three letters there on the far, far right extreme of the margin. Huge variations from day to day, mostly caused by wind, but also solar, with about 5 to 10-fold higher emissions than France, which is way down in the bottom in that pale blue-green line. And of course, it's 1.5 to, I'm sorry, 1.5-fold to 2-fold more expensive in Germany. This is coming to the fore now as they're not able to get gas from Russia, but every energy source has its drawbacks, but a recent comparison of Germany versus France has revealed this. And this is a fact based upon history, not just on a given day, but accumulated history over a period of months or even years. And she further makes another statement on that page 20. She says, no evidence that clean energy use can reduce fossil fuel use. And I strongly disagree with that. There's good evidence. And this, I think I may have shown you this slide before. It comes from a guy called poetandengineer.com is his website, and his theme is "We Need It All," and the subtitle is "We Know How to Do This." There are only 8 places on Earth with large electrical grids and very low carbon emissions. They all use hydro and nuclear power, along with intermittent wind and solar. And France is a leader, doing this mostly with nuclear that has been built 50 years ago. They have a bit of fossil fuel, but they also have a bit of wind and solar and a modest amount of hydro. Quebec, on the other hand, has done almost all of it by hydro. There's a popular prime minister of Quebec about 30 years ago who dammed up some lakes on the east side of Hudson Bay. It bothered some native Canadians a lot, but he did it anyway. And he at least can proudly say that his province is got pretty clean sources of energy, no pollution there. Ontario has done it partly with Niagara Falls, as you can see, about a quarter, but the province has grown so that they can't do it all with Niagara Falls, so they've used a lot of nuclear, and we'll hear about that from Neil Alexander in a few weeks. Sweden has done it equally pretty much between hydro and nuclear. The nuclear proponents in Sweden wanted to put some plants in the north, and the general Swedish parliament said, no, we've got plenty of hydro up there, thank you, keep your plants down in the south. So they did, and but they've got a good reputation. They had no trouble building those plants and the hydro dams and plants as well. So they've been very successful as a country, second only to France. Norway has done it mostly with hydro. They dig a lot of oil, of course, out of the seabed of the North Sea, but they don't consume it. They ship it off other places. British Columbia does very well also with hydro. Paraguay incredibly well with hydro, and Switzerland has a nice mix. So these are 8 places now. Not all of them do it with hydro, and those that have been most successful have mixed in nuclear as well. So to say that there's no evidence that clean energy use can reduce fossil fuel use, I think is proven wrong in this graph. So I argue with her on this point. There's another one that I've added in, and this is from Valerie Gardner. She runs an organization called Nucleation Capital, and she looks at it this way. She calls it the green paradox. The experts say we need all sources of clean energy, especially nuclear, to address both the need for baseload power and provide scalable, cheap energy. Perfectly good fact. But then she comes to the point that the environmentalists are most committed to saving the planet, but all were originally anti-nuclear, before there was any real operating data. And rather than read the data, because of the long-term opposition, has created cultural taboos, which prevent local leaders like the head of 350.org or Sierra Club. They're worried about losing their support if they say that they support nuclear. And so by prioritizing renewables rather than clean energy, we have this renewable portfolio, forgot what S stands for, but it's standard, that's the word, Renewable Portfolio Standard, or RPS. And the word standard is repeated here. It disadvantages nuclear power by enabling massive increases in gas use to support the renewables. So that's her explanation for the green paradox. And it is particularly true in Madison, I would say, but also in other places where greens are powerful, such as Germany. And they've even talking about trying to persuade French Prime Minister Macron to cut back from 78% to 50% nuclear. And why he would ever do that and make it a billionfold less efficient, I can't imagine. But their rivers in France are so low as a result of the lack of rain that many of the plants, unfortunately, have to scale back to 50% energy instead of the usual 95 or 90% capacity in order to keep from overheating their exhaust water exits into various rivers of France. I just showed this slide. This was from last Friday. I was listening to the International Crane Foundation talks, and I've not visited this lake in southern China, but it's a very important lake for migrating cranes, the white-naped cranes, the red-crowned cranes from Siberia, and migrate down to this special lake called Poyang Lake. And you can see a picture of it from the air where it's dark there. There are different levels show it either gray or dark gray 2 years ago. And this year, the dramatic difference, and they're having some serious problems. Those cranes are struggling to find Vallisneria, which is an important plant that they like to chew on, as well as crayfish and various other little organisms. And there's mostly just mud pools left. So they go over to farms that are irrigated and manage to find some irrigation ditches to work on. But then they have to have the support of the people, so the people won't go out and shoot them. So it's just another, not a problem for humans so much, but a problem for other wildlife. And it's not just the cranes. There are many other waterfowl that migrate and found Poyang Lake important, and they're now struggling. Fortunately, the people are pretty tolerant in China, but it's and put up with the birds, and some of them have a revere cranes, so it hasn't been too dangerous just yet. But it's of concern to see the changes just seen from outer space. Getting back to her talk, her book. She wants to define and compare zero versus net zero emissions, and talks about, well, we all know that it's not true that you can have no emissions. There are always some emissions from any kind of thing in the building, the mining, in any kind of life cycle analysis. So we accept that. But the new idea is net zero. And this is a problem because greenhouse gases are still allowed if they can be offset. That's this key fancy word, offset, by other activities that remove CO2 from the atmosphere, like adding a forest or capturing CO2. Well, the reality is that you need to wait a good 40 years before a forest is taking up a lot of CO2 and emitting oxygen in comparison. And capturing CO2 can be done nicely on Greenland and Iceland, I'm sorry. And also a little bit in parts of Switzerland. But to do that large scale is still fiction. Offsets are problematic, and a rationale for doing business as usual, BAU. In case you haven't seen that phrase before, you'll see it a lot in her writing and others. Our priority, she says, should be on reducing emissions from all sectors as soon as possible. We say the forests of the world absorb 30% of our annual carbon emissions, but we lost 178 million hectares in the last 30 years, and new forests will not absorb as much CO2. So the size of the forest, our so-called carbon sink, actually keeps shrinking despite our promises that we'll add a forest so that we can fly here or there. Airlines are even talking about being net zero. Well, I don't believe it. Not net zero if you're going to really cut greenhouse gas emissions. Well, so is carbon capture, we touched on that, is that a viable solution? She says, techno-optimists and oil lobbyists hope to capture CO2 as it's emitted. And they formed this group called the Carbon Capture Coalition, CCC. I'd never heard of it before, but apparently it's supported by Audubon, National Wildlife Foundation, and the Nature Conservancy. And they're organizations I support. And I'm shocked and saddened that they just say, well, we want to help bring an affordable supply of man-made CO2 to the market. And so they have this capture coalition. But I'm not sure it's going to happen. I'm skeptical, personally. Many others argue that carbon capture and sequestration, or CCS, is pie in the sky distraction from the work of ending fossil fuel burning. They criticize the IPCC for ignoring a safer, more ecologically coherent approach to climate mitigation. When she says many others, she includes herself and most of her colleagues with whom she relates closely. But I have to find myself agreeing with her. We must put justice front and center as we construct an economy that shares resources equitably within the planet's limits. Now, in a couple of weeks, we're going to visit the center where we're going to look at the LEED certification. Excuse me a second. This will be the Holy Wisdom Monastery, and I call it now a LEED trip. And LEED stands for the Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. It's an idea with good intentions. Its goal of reducing emissions, but it was, of all things, 24 years ago, is more often to make a profit. I think she's being a little tough on them, but I read out what she said to the guy who's going to give us a tour, Mark Hansen, who represents the LEED organization when we get there. So he's very aware of her criticism and says he'll deal with it, or at least try and rebut it. But once certified, he admits is true, there's no follow-up, and public money often gets siphoned into the private sector. And it's a good goal. It's great to start, but it needs to be followed through. I think is the criticism she has, and he acknowledges that's part of the problem. Residential and commercial buildings account for 13% of our greenhouse gas emissions, she states. But if we add the electricity that they draw from the grid to deal with all of the heat pumps and all the other things that we do to try and make keep our greenhouse gas emissions down, she said the real number, when you look at the electricity in particular that's drawn, you can reverse that number from 13% to 31%. And of course, the graph that George Erickson has shown us, methane is accelerating, and I put that over on the side just to remind us that not only do we have CO2 to worry about, which is constantly going up, as we know from the Keeling curves done in Hawaii, but the methane is going up too, and we are only measuring probably half of that. We don't know exactly what fraction, but certainly not 100% of it. So, to coming to her comments, our planetary emissions continue to rise in spite of heightened public awareness. Neither science nor technology gave us the answers on how to restructure or to live within planetary boundaries. It's easy for polluting industries to adopt new technologies or standards as a form of greenwashing while continuing business as usual. Our corporate system is only interested in perpetuating itself. Well, of course, they want to perpetuate itself. That's the only way they're going to survive. But we need to broaden our interests and not just put on a good front, but to follow through. Now, she's going to come in this section to various organizations and political things. I'm going to talk about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. COP stands for Meeting of the Parties or something like that. What's the C? Anyway, it has a number. What is it? Conference of the Parties, defined there. And they have one every year. This one was in Scotland, I believe. But just to look back at the history over the last 25 years, they started with 192 parties to this Kyoto Protocol back in 97, and 37 of the 92 were industrialized countries that did pledge to limit or reduce greenhouse gas emissions to agreed targets by about 5%, and or maybe more. But and on average, most countries actually reach their targets. 5% is perhaps not a very strenuous target, but they were helped a lot by the 2008 financial crisis and the collapse of the USSR around 1990. So later on, they had a second meeting, and of these parties, they had 142 of them, and 144 made a second commitment for the next 8 years from 2012 to 2020. Well, along in the middle of that came in the Paris Agreement. And that was in 2015, and it brought all countries on board, but it let them set their own targets, much of which were too weak to accomplish. 5 years later, we realize how hard this is going to be. So the pros and cons of pricing carbon relate to what's called emission trading systems that have been tried in the EU, California, and China. The most effective systems have hard declining emission caps. But critics argue that special industries such as manufacturing, aviation get free credits. Powerful oil interests are allowed banking credits while carbon emissions keep rising. Carbon taxes are simpler, but they've been too low to do more than hasten the transition from coal just to gas, which is every bit as bad as coal in many respects, not as bad on your personal health of your lungs, but in terms of the planet, more powerful greenhouse gas, it just doesn't stay quite as long in the atmosphere, decades instead of centuries. But this Climate Leadership Council was launched in 2017 by Ted Halstead, and it gained some tax support, but public resistance was generally high. I'm not giving you a chance to ask questions, and it's going to make it a bit easier for me if we can try and hold your questions, and then I'll try and deal with them at the end as best I can. Why does the USA subsidize the fossil fuel industry? Well, it's a good question, and I didn't realize until I read this the amount to which this FFI, fossil fuel industry, is supported by us. Both parties, Democrats and GOP administrations, promote fossil fuels in the name of economic growth, jobs, competitiveness. And you see how our present president is having a real problem with inflation and various other economic issues. And he doesn't dare say that we can't drill for oil. But during Obama's climate-friendly administration, we didn't have quite the stress that we're having right now, although we did in 2008 when he began. The Export-Import Bank spent $34 billion on fossil fuel projects, 70 of them. There are also indirect subsidies as governments assume public responsibility for damages that fossil fuels impose on society. For example, over $5 trillion a year globally is spent by governments to deal with the sorts of things such as happening in Puerto Rico right now that the governments are pretty slow to deal with. And we even bailed out our auto industry. I don't know if you remember that, but it was, to me, it was shocking. We're still going along with Fahrenheit temperatures after we bailed them out, and they're having a struggle still. So solutions proposed by environmentalists. This is an interesting thought. I hadn't thought about the different level of climate enthusiasts. She says that these environmentalists have been supported by the Nature Conservancy, Environmental Defense Fund, World Wildlife Fund, etc. NRDC is very popular. Natural Resources Defense Council are very powerful attorneys there. And they, some of them are anti-nuclear, particularly the latter. They collaborate with polluting corporations and the IPCC to promote largely unproven technologies. So that was her big statement there. And then she defines three kinds of climate environmentalists. There are the climate hawks, who focus exclusively on lowering their carbon emissions, period. That's it. Then there's the climate left that say that effective action must challenge capitalism itself. It's getting deep into the nitty gritty of the problem. And then there are the degrowth advocates who say that rich countries must reduce their use of the planet's resources. A little similar to the other, but focus more on the rich countries. And all are environmentalists, she says, and she emphasizes this, but with profoundly different perspectives. She doesn't go into it in great depth, and I think it would have taken another book probably to do that. But interesting that you can look at environmentalists from these 3 points of view, 3 categories. And she does touch on the Green New Deal. I didn't realize, or I had forgotten, that this goes back to OAC and Ed Markey to February 2009. So it's, but when the bill went through, so that's already, gosh, 13 years ago. And it was a demand by young activists in the Sunrise Movement for Congress to take action. It established an ambitious enforceable target with goals that prioritize the rights of workers. Sounds good so far, but by calling for net zero emissions, it held the door open for carbon trading and offsets. Serious problem in my mind. And also, it did not make clear if clean energy sources would include nuclear. They're up and down on that. Lately, they seem to be supporting it more. Biofuels, which I think is a terrible idea, and even worse, natural gas, or every bit as bad. So the Green New Deal has not gotten very far. It was met a lot of ridicule, not only by the Conservative Party, but by many people across the political spectrum. So to summarize climate policies, various paths have been proposed by the IPCC, and they rely on unproven carbon capture technologies, enabling production and economic growth to continue. She says the IPCC ignores, and I put that in red, a simpler and more obvious alternative that we find ways to slow or reverse economic growth in the over-consuming countries. Given how long we have known about climate change and its impact on human survival, why have we been unable to change course? Because every sector of industrial society depends on fossil fuels, and industries lobby for their interests while voters are reluctant to support policies that imply sacrifice. So I think she's summarized the dilemma, raised the question, and sort of answered the question. I have a problem with this idea of that things might plateau if we allow for another 1.5 degrees centigrade or Celsius. And that, of course, is a total myth. There's no evidence at all that it's going to plateau, especially when the greenhouse gases like CO2 last around for centuries. Whoever thought that, who understands that it's going to plateau at 1.5 or 2 degrees is just a dreamer. Anyway, talking about this other book I mentioned that supplements this one, I think, and I haven't talked about it very much because she's a very good writer. She doesn't have quite the charm. She's very factual. She's from the University of Edinburgh, and she has provided a couple of tables which I found useful, and I have them coming up. The table here is individuals. What can we do, or what can I do? And she has this list. Tons, of course. TONNES is 1.1 American tons of CO2 avoided per year by an individual. If, for example, you have one fewer child than you might have had otherwise, then you could not only save a lot of college, which I think is kind of the college cost, which is probably more of a motivator in today's society, but you might reduce 4 tons of CO2 per year. This is my answer to the population problem. There are going to be other answers coming up along the way. But people, I don't think, are thinking very much about the world population problem when they think about how many children they're going to have. And for us, of course, we're grandparents and most of us. And so we made those decisions a long time ago. I was amused by her comment later on Here is a Scottish woman. She says that 4 tons is an average. It would be 7 tons in the United States because we're such big polluters, and only 1.4 tons if you live in France. I thought that was funny. But focus on what you can achieve by working with others who are also motivated by climate change. And this is the key. For example, if you live car free, that can do a lot. But if you go down to switch to a hybrid car halfway down the table, only a quarter of that. A lot of us are driving hybrid cars. And she says, if you do it, that's fine. But unless you achieve it by working with others and form, let's say, a hybrid group, which was formed here back in the between 2005 and 2010 or so. We had a Madison hybrid group, Hybrid Fest, we called it. And but we disbanded by about 2010 because by that time, most of the people in Madison had caught on who were persuadable, let's say. And so it's not a big deal now, but she said you're going to be much more effective if you tell other people about it, you act on it, rather than just quietly do it yourself. Being a Scotswoman, she says she's thinking about transatlantic flights. And that's if you just avoid one of them per year, that's a big chunk in tons of CO2, 1.6. That's a big chunk of weight. If you switch to green heating, about half as good. I'm not sure, she doesn't define what green heating means, but I would imagine it would be using a heat pump instead of air conditioner. And in Scotland, that might be pretty easy to do. If you have a deep retrofit of your house, it would be almost as good. Those often go together. Combine them two, you might get 1.4. I switched to a hybrid car. She's not too impressed with that. Plant-based diet. I'm sorry that that's so low. I would hope that that would be higher. That's a lot of work to switch to a plant-based diet. Maybe they don't use so much beef up in Scotland. I think they do. But recycle. She's got that way down the list. Everybody likes to say, well, I'm concerned about the planet. I recycle. If you jump from recycling down to the bottom one, it's kind of funny. Reuse a plastic bag 1,000 times. That's 1/8 as effective as 1/15 as effective as recycling. If you avoid a European flight, if you're in Scotland and you avoid a European flight, that's half as good as recycling. And if you hang dry your clothes, it's a little less. Buy LED lights, that's pretty, we all do that now anyway. You can't have not much choice, but it's not a big benefit, according to her. I guess it depends on how many lights you have in the house and how much you leave them on. Greenhouse gas equivalents. Here's your other table. I find this one really quite good. I had gone to the trouble of building a table for you with the data that I got in the text of Aviva's book, and then dividing, but it came out as percentages. And then when you divide it by billions of people, it was a horrible statistic. And these data are much more meaningful. They're in metric tons, CO2 equivalent, and they're total and per capita, and they're really quite revealing. I didn't think that if you go from totals, of course, China is a huge country with a big population. And so if you go to per capita, they're not so bad. They're only half as bad as we are. India, only a quarter or less as bad as we are. Russia comes close to us. Iran comes close. But we're beaten by Canada of all countries. I'm embarrassed, having lived there and been educated there, to think, I guess the only explanation I can think of is that being farther north, they burn more methane and to keep warm. And also, if you don't have methane, then they use propane, which is a little bit worse. But that's a shame that Canada is so high up there. I've been giving them credit for all this nuclear energy and hydro, and their greenhouse gas emissions are no better as a country. Ontario, I'm sure, Quebec, if you pick those two provinces, would be much better. But as a country, not doing so well. Well, she then actually raises this question. My daughter passed along this map to me. I think she did anyway. But the question she raises, perhaps we should hold the CEOs accountable, not the country. And so this is a weird map and you can't see the fine print, but if you way up at the top here in the upper left, They've got almost in the Yukon the word Calgary, and underneath that, all the names of people who were CEOs of major energy companies, mostly probably coming out of the Athabasca tar sands. And you can go down to Gillette and Findlay and so on, Cleveland, Denver, and she's got the name, or he or she, somebody has put this together. What I'd like to point out in this slide is not so much the names, but the swollen map. Of course, the map is swollen by the amount of carbon emissions, so the land area expresses carbon emissions. But just notice where the equator is. The equator cuts through, as you well know, through Ecuador and through Central Africa and through Indonesia. And look at the difference between the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. If it weren't for South Africa, boy, there'd be, and a bit in Australia, there'd be not very much. And of course, the Southern Hemisphere is suffering the most. And this is the key to climate justice. We're doing all the polluting and they're doing most of the suffering. Yeah, we did have a lot of forest fires in California. And, but compared to the earthquakes and which is not really climate related, but still occurs there, and the tidal waves and all the other problems, mostly the disappearing islands under the ocean, they're really going to be suffering a lot more than we are. And what can we do? What can we do about that? Well, what are we doing now? Energy is a basic need. We sell it to those with money. We create, we control it with our wealth and our poverty. Those who have the money sell it to those with not so much money. And so we create and accentuate the difference between wealth and poverty through energy. The costs of climate change are borne by the poor. And finally, her remark is, this is the antithesis of democracy. So what should we be doing? Well, we should lift energy resources and decisions out of private hands and put them under some form of public control. I think I have to find that helpful when we've been talking, some of us in a subgroup called Friends of Fission of this group have been trying to talk with people who run utilities, and they do have boards of directors, but they all want a return on their investments. And in contrast to France or other parts of the world where the government strongly supports these private utilities, the profit margin can make it really difficult to have some form of public control as opposed to private control so that we can deal with the less fortunate people. She admits, she says this in the orange line there, this may be difficult since Saudi Aramco and Gazprom are traded corporations like British Petroleum, and even Norway with 95% of its hydro emits a lot of tons per year per capita. So far, we have little say in the matter. Most of us don't even know how our energy is produced. And I find it quite amazing when I talk to people if they have any knowledge in Wisconsin, and most people would be shocked, have no idea that about 70% or 75% of our electricity comes from burning fossil fuels. So in conclusion, should justice issues be linked to our fight to slow climate change? Justice matters for its own sake, and justice is tightly bound with our historical approach to climate disaster. We have created a wealthy global north and an impoverished global south based on 500 years of colonialism, extraction, production, profit, and economic growth. Boy, that sounds like a history professor. We need to understand the system in order to change it. Well, that's sure true. So she now goes to a chapter called Broadening the Lens, and it's already 5 to 11, and I could just touch briefly on these 5 huge questions. Is population growth at the root of the problem? A few of you have already written to me and asked me if I would touch on this. She says, she reviews the history and says, well, the debate goes back to Thomas Malthus in 1798 Advances in technology and industry appeared to prove him wrong. Fertility rates have been below replacement here and in the EU for the past 50 years. The problem is the third world. Lower child mortality has caused people to increase the number of children that they have. And she says, yes, the Earth's human population stresses boundaries, but not so much from population as from consumption per person. And we really need that. That's both our problems, but consumption per person, she feels, is the greater problem. Is immigration bad for the environment? Sierra Club and 350.org both opposed it initially, but both now focus on reducing consumption per person. So they've caught on, at least those organizations. Economic growth, she says there's a long history of viewing this favorably. Most jobs, products, living standards. But she says the increase in GDP and the increase in personal consumption can lead to not only climate problems, but obesity, pollution as well. So we really need to think seriously about our need to always be growing. I notice the catalogs that come in the mail these days. I guess I've got a history of being a bit of a consumer because I get catalogs and they all are trying to get me to consume. They want cute little things to be sold and they're just going to accumulate around the house. So I think I try and keep saying, of course, it's easier to do at my age to not to buy so many new things. Can we grow? Our last point. Are we making progress? Can we grow without making more emissions? There's some evidence to support a bit of decoupling between growth and emissions. And this has come up a few times in some statistics over the last decade, but she says most of this was based on our CO2 emissions as we shifted from coal to methane. So yeah, that's going to lower. I've forgotten the reduction in CO2 emissions. I think it's about fourfold, something like that. Although it's a worse greenhouse gas, the actual carbon dioxide emissions are lower as you burn methane than coal. And so methane may make the statistics look good over the past decade, but if so, it's a one-time fix. So she says we shouldn't take too much heart in that. This fourth point here, do we even need growth? Her comment there is the idea that more is not necessarily better is an old one. We need to think twice about whether we really need more. Now, the concept of growth improved after the Depression or World War II and led to the economic development of the third world poverty as the rich became richer and the poor became poorer. So we shouldn't necessarily be fixed on the idea of growth. So almost finished, but I think this is an excellent slide. She doesn't mention it at all, but I think it's a good one. The question is raised at the top. What are we waiting for? Just ignore that bit about 60% chance of staying below 2 degrees centigrade. That's a myth, so forget that. But the dates go from 1980 to 2100. And you can see the vertical line there at 2020. And go down to the lower right. And it says, looking now at CO2 emissions from fossil fuels in gigatons of CO2 per year. If we had started mitigation back in 2000, so go over to 2000 now, if you can, I don't know if you can see my pointer here. And if we'd started doing mitigation back then, all we would have needed was 3% reduction in emissions per year to get down to respectable levels by 2100. But if we had started 4 years ago instead of 22 years ago, we could still have required a mitigation rate here of around 10% per year, much worse than 3%. But look what happens if we wait another 10 years, which is what we seem to be doing to reduce our carbon emissions, if we do it at all. It'll require 30% per year. So it's an interesting mathematical solution to the question, what are we waiting for? Obviously, we need to get moving faster. Now, can't close without at least acknowledging this IRA bill, Inflation Reduction Act. This is a projection of net greenhouse gas emissions I found recently in the press. I think it was probably New York Times. And they're trying to get below 2005 levels, which is up there right under the word house in greenhouse. And we're well over 6 billion metric tons of CO2 equivalents. And the goal was to get down to 50% of that by 2030. And you can see that what would have happened if we just kept our current policies, we maybe got a quarter of the way there instead of halfway down. But with the new climate bill, they're projecting that if we follow it, and I think the indications are that we might well do it. They seem to be things that are reasonably popular with at least a majority of Congress, fair majority, that we might get down significantly better as a result of that. So it's nice to be able to take some, rather than be totally depressed, to take some positive things by what we've accomplished. And I think we shouldn't forget that. Also, this is a serious issue though, the word climate migrant and climate refugee. Most climate migrants move within the borders of their homelands, usually from rural areas to cities, after losing their livelihoods because of drought, rising seas, etc. Because cities, though, have their own climate-related problems, high temps and water scarcity, people then flee from the cities across international borders to seek refuge. But there's a problem there. Climate migrants are not afforded refugee status under the 1951 Refugee Convention, which provides legal protection only to people fleeing persecution due to race, religion, nationalities, political opinion, or particular social group. So climate refugees are going to become a dominant problem, and we don't yet have any good way of fixing them. It's been in the news a lot lately as people are flown to Chicago and Martha's Vineyard. Some people call it a stunt, but some of the people were reasonably happy to go, maybe from ignorance, but some of them may have had family in those places. It may have helped some of them, but it was, of course, a political stunt as well. So in conclusion, who will lead us? Can you imagine a world leader? This is a deep question and a tough one. The IPCC urges at 1.5 degrees centigrade. What's real here? Where's that going to go? Are we going to stop there? Somebody dreams? What about pandemics? What about the zoonoses? We now think that it was not the Hunan laboratory, although we'll never know for certain, but there's a fair amount of evidence, genetic evidence, to suggest that that did not come from a lab in China, but came from people selling bushmeat in the markets there. And zoonoses are diseases transmitted to man from animals, could lead to future pandemics. And that could be a big problem. We need to imagine and act. And this is just a curve about the most economic damage that countries have done based upon, mostly on the gross national product and how much pollution they put into the air. And so these are listed in TN, I'm not sure, Terra something, I'm not sure I'm sorry, I've forgotten that one. Maybe it says down there, don't see it, but it relates to 2010 US dollars. And the United States, of course, is leading the world, percent of all losses, 16%, China, Russia, India, Japan, Venezuela, Germany, Canada is there, and UK. France is not, Sweden is not. There are a number of other countries that have not been such bad polluters. But anyway, we're the top ones, so we need to get busy. So my final slide is this one. I had the pleasure of having supper with her once when she came to the International Crane Foundation, found her as delightful a person as one could ever meet. She came out with a calendar this year in which she offers 4 reasons for hope. And I think we need to end on a hopeful note. She said reasons that she's optimistic is the indomitable spirit of the human race, the resilience of nature, the human intellect, and the power of young people to make a positive impact. So I hope that I'm delighted that she has that optimism, and I think that we need to persist with that so that we can continue to try and help the planet. So those are my slides. I'm going to stop the sharing now. It's a few minutes after 11, and I'll look at the questions and answers. Starting off with Lou. Since the Clean Air Act in the early 1970s, the automakers cleaned up emissions and continually increased their MPG. So thank you, Lou. That's a good point, that we were talking about miles per gallon, but in terms of consuming fuel. But cleaning up emissions is really an important one in terms of not so much the planet, but our personal health as we're breathing in those emissions following the vehicles on the road, or if you live near the road. So I would agree that we should acknowledge that. So I'm answering that one live. Lee says, did you know that chat is disabled? Sorry about that. I think I'm not sure if I was aware. She then raises a question, one caution about plant-based diet. Dr. Furman, F-U-H-R-M-A-N, who does recommend a plant-based diet, nutrition diet, says that it is important to supplement to make up for nutrients that you miss by not eating meat. Years ago, several vegetarians he knew all contracted Parkinson's disease. That's quite a statement. I've never heard of nutrition deficiencies being responsible for Parkinson's disease. I heard it more possibly based upon exposure to metals in industry. I'll look into that, but I certainly agree that anybody on a vegetarian diet should take both types of supplements, both vitamins and minerals. I think anybody with a good basic understanding of health would know that. I think everybody over 55, or certainly over 60, has a far less efficient gastrointestinal system for absorbing vitamins from any kind of diet, and should probably seriously consider having vitamin tests done on their bloodstream, particularly vitamin D3, and taking vitamin supplements. So I'm all for supplements if you're a vegetarian, no problem there. Lou Harnish says, Japan's population is aging. With reduced or zero population growth, who takes care of the retired generation? That's a good one. We're all going to come up with that, but I think you put your finger on it, Lou, that Japan is probably going to feel it before any other country. The young people tend to, first of all, they've taken population control more seriously, I think, than other countries. But it applies a good bit to Western Europe. Italy and France also, their populations are aging. I think we're just going to have to change our tax systems or suffer. I can't think of any other solution for the retired generation. The idea of privatizing Social Security is one that's fraught with hazard. And I think that democracies in general, and Japan is a pretty good democracy since World War II, getting better, I think, all the time. We'll see to it that they tax the earners sufficiently, and I think some governments are inclined to try and supplement their taxes with various lotteries and things like that. Unfortunately, the people who spend their money in lotteries are generally the people who can't afford to. And so that might not be a very good idea. But as far as I can tell, I don't have a good answer for you other than good government action. This is what democracies are all about. So that's all I can offer as an answer. Appreciate your question. On book 2, he said, "Who is the author and what climate justice means?" That's good. I'm glad you asked that. Again, it's Elizabeth Cripps, which you might be able to see there in the upper corner. And I could read to you a little bit about her. She says, Bill McKibben writes and says, "The iron law of global warming is the less you did to cause it, the sooner and harder you suffer its effects. As this book makes clear, that raises very deep questions about justice, which we will be grappling with for the foreseeable future. If you read this, you have a good head start on a crucial debate." So I have to agree with Bill on that one. Mark Maslin says, "Insightful, timely, and compelling. Climate justice is essential if we're to deal with climate change." Probably of the two books, it's hard to say which I like better. I found Aviva's book just a little more fun to read, but they're both outstanding books. It's hard to judge one over the other, and I'm glad that you're interested, and thanks for reminding me to mention her name again, Lou. Another question: the US has decreased the life expectancy to solve the retirement problem. That's quite a statement. I don't know who is asking that question. There's some numbers at the top, 445-937. But that's quite a statement. The US has decreased the life expectancy to solve the retirement problem. I don't think that's true. I think our goal is to increase life expectancy. It has gone down in the past few years from, I think, 79 to 76, if I remember the numbers correctly, primarily due to COVID. I wouldn't say it's to solve the retirement problem. I would say it's a consequence of people not willing to accept the truth. The education of almost 50% of our public seems to be based upon what they read on their cell phones, and not and the things they read on their cell phones have nothing to do with the National Institutes of Health, which they could easily read from their cell phones. And so I don't think that's that the United States has decreased it to solve the retirement problem. I don't think the retirement problem is a big one. Of course, everything is a big problem in our Congress that's so deeply opposed to itself. I've heard people talking about an impending civil war because we're so divided as a country. I hope it doesn't get to that, but I don't think that we intentionally did that. That was primarily, I think, a side effect of unwillingness to be vaccinated. It's a huge segment of our population does not want to get vaccinated. This myth going around that's a little bit of alumina in salts or ions in some of the vaccines, and that's led to some mental retardation or mental effects. No good evidence to support that, but that's out there and does affect people, and they will live to regret it. Most of them, when they see their children violently ill with not only COVID but with measles and chickenpox and mumps, and the vaccines that they used to use and got turned off of for various false reasons. So I just won't agree with that one. Lou writes, "Wonderful slides and commentary and a mind-expanding presentation in terms of the breadth and depth of this topic." Thanks, Lou. I appreciate your comment. It was the toughest one I've worked on. It certainly expands our mind. I find that I learn a lot by doing the readings. One thing to read a book, another to read it in a way that you can try and express it to someone. And The other books have been mostly a lot of fun. This one was not so much fun, but I think it was important to do. And I feel a relief after your nice compliment and after having it passed, because um, it was a tough one, tough to read, tough to think about. But I think all of us here, and I appreciate all of you for the listening in, because I'm hoping that you will go on and use it to um, influence others around you and your families, and um, and that's all a good thing. I won't go into the details now about the topics that are coming up, except to say that next, I'll talk about the next 3 or 4 weeks. Um, Next week is called Phytoplankton and Krill, and I think I've added more recently and more. It expands on the entire problem of carbon sequestration in the oceans and how important it is. Fascinating subject and easy to talk about, and I think we can have a little more interchange then because there'll be more time. The third one, How to Drive a Nuclear Reactor, is strictly a book review, and I found it a lot of fun. He's a Welshman who gives lots of lectures about the safety. He really focuses on the safety of nuclear reactors. They're generation 2 water moderated reactors in England, but he talks a bit about a variety of them. But it's really easy reading, fairly easy, and I find as you learn more about something, you have less fear. It's just what Marie Curie always used to say. Finally, on October the 10th, we're going to have that lead trip to the Holy Wisdom Monastery, and we'll need to have a conversation about carpooling. I think there isn't that big a problem if you want to drive there yourselves. It's just off the road to around the north of the Lake Mendota as you go through Middleton and out the east side of Middleton. And as the road makes a bend to the right, there's a driveway past the main golf course there, a quarter of a mile, and that just leads you into the Holy Wisdom Monastery. We were there about 5 or 6 years ago, and I was glad that they put us in touch with Mark Hansen, who will meet us there and give us some remarks about how well or how not so well it is done in the past 5 or 6 years since we were there. Maybe, I think it was 2014, so that's 7 years ago. So that would be on our own. We won't have any of these Zoom lectures that day. It'll be strictly meeting 9:30 at the parking lot at the southwest corner of Target, where we used to park and sometimes carpool to other places. I'm hoping that you, Tony, will be able to help me out, and any others who would like to do so as well. Possibly you, Mert, or anybody who lives nearby. We can help give some rides and then not have quite so many cars. It won't be as big a problem as it might have been if we had gone to the recycling. And the recycling actually was for this fall, and it got bumped. And so, but Tony is going to kindly persist with that, and maybe we'll do that in the spring. And then after that, we'll have Lou Harnish talk about the real trajectory for a zero emission world. I think that's a fascinating topic, and you're reviewing, I think, a good book that you've read on that subject, and I'm looking forward to that, Lou, very much. And I won't go beyond there, but I think we're going to have 10 sessions in total, plus this field trip. So it looks to be a nice fall, and I appreciate everybody contributing in your various ways. So any other questions or thoughts? I see Robert Getz, a newcomer. Robert, he says, the reading for today was much more depressing and used 2040 to 2050 as an end of life date if radical change does not take place. Yeah, that was tough. I think I mainly set it out for two things. Number one is I think it's a good discussion of greenhouse gas molecules and how they change the vibrations of the spectrum of light and electromagnetic radiation from the sun, and how it gets trapped by the upper layers of the atmosphere, the larger the atom is, and we're living with lots of O2 and N2 in our atmosphere, and that allows the light to electromagnetic radiation to pass out through the upper clouds. I thought that was a nice discussion, but I also said it because it represents the reality of climate change and how serious a problem it is. Nobody wants to talk about it. It's kind of like the movie that you may have seen called Don't Look Up. They made that into a bit of a comedy and a satire, whereas this is a more serious thing by, I think, Professor Anderson. So yeah, it was, I don't think that 2040 to 2050 is really going to be the end of life on Earth, but I think that it's going to be tough for us by 2050. It's already tough. I wouldn't want to be living in Puerto Rico. I'm sorry. And other parts of the world are going to suffer too. Islands are going to go underwater. So parts of the world will suffer more than others. But I think life in general will probably persist no matter what we do. But we might end up, our species, in 100 or 200 or 300 years if we don't behave better and learn from not just what was set out, but from the comments made today by Aviva. I'm grateful to her for writing that book, and also Elizabeth Cripps. And I think that you can buy those books. They're not very expensive, and pass them around amongst your family and friends. They're serious reading, but we do need to come to grips with it. Let's see if there are any. Oh, Tony writes. He says, here is my take on the 5 questions, broaden the lens slide. He says, population growth? Yes. She asked the question, is population growth the root of the problem? And Tony would say, yes, I would agree with you, yes. It's not the only root. I think consumption is more important than population, but because the populations of Western Europe and the United States, particularly Western Europe, are going down, and yet the consumption is going up, and the net emissions, particularly from Germany, are going up, and Poland. Immigration, is immigration bad for the environment? He says yes. I think that's true because people lose their homes and have to be supported by welcoming, sympathetic society. So I agree with that. Economic growth. The question there was, how does economic growth affect the environment? And you say yes, we're all agreed on that. Do we need growth? Yeah, questionable. Yeah, I like that answer. For you, deeply involved with many businesses, I think that could be a lovely topic for you to give in the spring, Tony, if you'd like to pick that topic. Are we making progress? He says yes in some ways, but nowhere enough. I couldn't agree more. Thank you, Tony, for that nice take on it. I appreciate you sending that in. It's probably the most important slide of the talk, and it was nice that you did that. Any other thoughts? Let's see if I can, oh, the 10, yeah. What else have we got here? Chat function. Yeah. I think that didn't do it. So you're right. It's just a question and answer that's working. And appreciate all those comments and feedback, guys. So it's 11:20 or so. And unless we have anything more, anybody wants to put a hand up. Robert, did you want to, I can allow you to talk if you'd like to say something. You may have to unmute yourself if you'd like to. Robert Getz is a newcomer to our group. He is has some background from Rochester, New York, I believe. And let me see if I have my notes on Robert. Yeah. Anyway, I think Robert is a good thinker, and I'm glad to have you among our group. I'm sorry if do I hear your voice?
Rich.
Pardon?
You can hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay. As we had discussed before the class began, maybe about a week ago, I agreed with you that nuclear power was the eventual answer, particularly in countries where hydro wasn't that feasible. But it occurs to me, particularly in the less affluent countries of the world, the better off nations would have to be financing the development of what I would call regional nuclear power plants, because a good part of most of the nations of the world probably couldn't afford to finance them themselves. So most of the burden would have to be carried by what we would call currently well industrialized nations, which is another problem, getting people to be willing to finance it. And although the young people of the world seem to be the most concerned about the climate problem, that doesn't come as any surprise to me, because public opinion is really generated what I've called the attentive public. Joe and Josie six-pack don't know much about the climate change threat. And if we had a more attentive public, then public opinion might have a greater influence. But I don't think that's probable. I think also that the Faustian bargain article also brought up the problems of the Arctic Ocean and the disaster headed there.
Yes. Yes, that's a problem. I agree with you, Robert, on most of your points as I recall them. I think that the public opinion is important because it's the young public, I think, who are a little more idealistic,
Yes.
who can perhaps keep our politicians reflective of the youth. And so I think we need to make sure that we preserve the ability of those people to vote with mail-in ballots and that sort of thing if they find it difficult. So we do need to have a democratic society that's reflective of all the age groups. And I'm hoping that we can improve the quality of information that gets out to the young people, and that we can persuade them to read more than their cell phones. I think it's good for their posture as well as their brains. And so I'm hoping that that will take place. But thank you for your comments, Robert. Well,
Welcome.
I think it's a good time to say so long, and look forward to seeing you next week with some fun with the oceans. And until then, have a nice week, and thanks all for attending. I will just check and see 13 participants left. And see you all. Have a good week. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.